Black Hills Information Security, the leaders in penetration testing and active defense. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to request a quote today. Threat Connect is the industry's most widely adopted threat intelligence platform, built to unite the people, processes, and technologies across your security team, your organization, and your entire ecosystem of partners. Threat Connect's threat intelligence platform enables your team to collaborate, analyze, and make sense of threat data all in one place. Empower your team towards fast and efficient analysis that leads to decisive action. Transform your entire threat detection and response program today. Claim your free account at threatconnect.com/securityweekly. Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries and enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge of the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries at the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame, automate the hunt. Welcome back to Paul Security Weekly. We're here actually with Mark Dufresne from Endgame. And Mark, you are, and I had your title down and then it escaped me, Director of Threat Intelligence and something else. What is your exact title? It's a really cool title. So
it's Threat Research and Adversary Prevention, but we can just summarize that with Find Bad Stuff. Find Bad Stuff. Well, Mark, welcome to Paul Security Weekly. It's wonderful to have you on the show this evening. Yeah, thanks for having me. And now, for those listening, and we're doing a webcast with Mark next Tuesday. It'll be myself, John Strand, and Mark presenting about threat hunting. So make sure you check that out and register at securityweekly.com/hunt. So, Mark, we're going to talk about, and I loved your topic. I twisted the title a little bit, and I hope Mr. Brody isn't too mad with how we've twisted the title. But I put it as why signatures suck, right? I love it. It's perfect. He's going to love that too. Yeah, I think he will. So why don't you kick it off and talk about, as it relates to some of your research and experiences, the limitations with signatures, the problems with signatures, and then we'll get into some of the ways in which we are getting around those issues. Yeah, sure. So, yes, I mean, at Endgame, we're all about let's detect bad at all phases of the attack life cycle. And so, kind of get into how do you do that? And to do this effectively, you really can't rely on signatures anymore. I think a lot of us in the industry for a while, there used to be kind of the good old days when adversaries had set up on the same infrastructure for potentially years at a time. You might see the same infrastructure used for a whole lot of different attacks, and you might see the same malware getting used for a long, long time across a lot of different targets. I think we're all seeing that just isn't so much the case anymore. It doesn't work. I mean, you see, on the network side, you see encryption being used a lot more, so your network monitoring becomes hard. And I think more importantly, you're seeing cloud services being used as part of a lot of attacks to avoid any kind of monitoring, because you can't block Twitter and you can't block Microsoft OneDrive in most environments, and adversaries use that stuff to get through. And you see a lot of things like customized infrastructure only used for a little bit of time, and even just like one-off targeting of like a broad spear phishing campaign, and then once somebody gets in, they might pivot to some other infrastructure that's just for them. So things have just gotten a little bit different. And on the host side, it's the same thing. Not only adversaries are using a little more custom malware and churning through their tool sets more and more because they know that they don't want a compromise in one network to compromise their operations all over the world. So they kind of are careful and increasingly just using legitimate creds and living off the land when they can. So it's like the question becomes, well, does it really help me all that much for somebody else to tell me what just hit them? And in a lot of cases, it doesn't. It's just not effective. And it's interesting, Mark. Mm-hmm. Back in the days of network intrusion detection systems, we used to implement signatures and could find the actual exploit traveling over the network. Mm-hmm. Not obviously 100% of the time, but you would find stuff, probably 10 or 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. I think as attackers got smarter and started encrypting not encrypting, but obfuscating their exploits using different methods of obfuscation, that got harder. So then we sort of turned to maybe detecting some of the payloads. Mm-hmm. And then I think Metasploit really came along and made that kind of mainstream to be able to just take your payloads and put them in any kind of different format that you wanted to. And then it started moving to the endpoint where the payloads and the exploits weren't necessarily going over the network as much. There may be some trigger points that go over the network, but a lot of it's happening on the endpoint. And antivirus vendors were like, well, we can write signatures for all that stuff. And then that didn't work. And now here we are today, and we're really in terms of signature detection, it's pretty much useless at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you probably don't want to entirely rip out your entire signature-based stack because it helps you with the low tier stuff, and it's kind of still necessary, but it's not sufficient to find anything good or find anything you're going to find before it's caused a whole bunch of problems in your network. I mean, the whole point, what we're trying to do on my team is help people find stuff early and find stuff that no one else has ever seen before. And so you can't do that with signatures. A signature might help you find something that's been in your network for 6 to 9 months, the amount of time it takes for that sig to get written, and Lord knows what's happened during that amount of time. So it's not going to be good enough.
And so when you want to overcome this problem of signatures, I think, John Stren and I have talked about this on the Enterprise Security Weekly. A lot of people will say, well, we use behavior-based technology. And then when we look under the covers, they've really just written a signature for the behavior. And I don't know if you can speak to that problem, but that's something that we've encountered.
Yeah, and some of that stuff can be pretty brittle, depending on how the signatures are written and what they're looking at. I mean, a lot of things, there's a lot of discussion that goes around. You guys have had some of it sounds like, on, well, what constitutes a signature? Is a description of a behavior still really a signature? In a way it is. So I guess some of those rules-based approaches tend to fall flat in their face. Because of that, because they're brittle, right? They might be good. I wouldn't call that a signature. I would call it more of like a heuristic or like some logic rules to fire.
I think you're right. Heuristic is the right word for that. Yes.
But they're valuable, but they're brittle, and those things have their own problems. I mean, a lot of those things, like those big user behavior analytics things, they sound great on paper, but a lot of times in an actual deployment, they get really noisy and really just don't do a good job of dealing with a super diverse environment where people are moving all over the place doing things people do, and you end up getting overwhelmed by FPs and turn it off. So that's not really good either.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a challenge when we talk about the UBA solutions. When you're looking at logs, certainly that can be difficult. So when you look for problems, how much of it is looking in the logs versus monitoring what's going on at the system in real time?
Yeah, so we started like super low. So we've got kind of two big things. I think about, let's detect things right when they try to install and kind of burrow into the OS and entrench themselves to do things. So like those early phase activities, once they land in the box, they have to execute something on the box. They've got to, once they get in, they got to run. They might drop some malware. They might not. They might just go purely malwareless. They usually try to escalate privileges. They'll try to be stealthy. A lot of attackers will try to, inject into memory or go in memory only to hide from other AV products and get some privilege escalation benefits out of that. They'll usually try to dump creds. They'll do recon. They'll figure out what to do next. I mean, so there's just like this set of things that happen every single time, at least some subset of those things I just listed. And so, we try to knock out, how do we look at those things as they're happening, in the kernel in real time? Because you end up having some abilities to look at certain system resources. We sometimes call them choke points that you can just sit there and stare at and wait for adversaries to cross through those choke points. Like, what resources exist on the system that they're going to have to go touch, or things they're going to have to go do if they want to dump creds from a box? It's a pretty small set of things, and you can stare at those things, and if you're smart about it, you can understand what are the things that happen normally that also touch those resources, and you can deliver a pretty solid way to detect bad in real time, requiring no signatures, just requiring the fact that the actor who wants creds has to go do this, and so put that in and stack these things up, and you end up causing really with pretty high effectiveness finding things as they're going on in the system, and you have the benefit of, hey, you can flip a switch and prevent it since you're in the kernel and do whatever you want.
A lot of my penetration tester friends have found some great success in using PowerShell to be able to do stuff on the box. So where do we stand with PowerShell today in being able to be very stealthy and not get caught by really any kind of endpoint detection system?
Yeah, PowerShell does an awesome job. There's a lot of benefits of PowerShell. You can just access just about all the functionality in the OS, but a huge thing, it makes it super easy to inject straight into memory and just run in memory. So you avoid disk entirely and go just bananas using, you can just use .NET and get access to just about any resource you want to do your collection operations and move around. It's really good, and most products do a really poor job of dealing with PowerShell. And we're doing some research now on how to instrumentation of PowerShell and logging with all the different versions of PowerShell that are deployed on different systems. PowerShell 2 up through PowerShell 5. There's different levels of data you can get off systems. There's different logging levels, but there's also it's kind of easy to bypass some of the PowerShell logging that's built in. So we're looking at ways to instrument and see that stuff happening, but to kind of take like a high view. But at a low view, all those PowerShell things that those pen testers are doing are still ending up doing process injection. If they want to try to dump creds through PowerShell, they're still going to touch these system resources in the kernel. So it doesn't really matter where you come at that from a programmatic standpoint. You still end up touching these resources if you're watching them in the kernel.
Mark, I'm going to... because I know you're a super smart person, and I have faith in you. I'm going to throw a couple of curveballs at you of some research that I've done lately, and you're more than welcome to say that you can get back and we'll run it on the show.
Yeah, sure.
So there's two methods that I wanted to ask you about that came to mind in our conversation. One is I interviewed researchers from CyberArk Labs that were able to put the system in safe mode and bypass a lot of protection technologies. What's your experience with that, and what are some ways that you can think of to protect systems that are being purposely put into safe mode?
So I haven't actually looked at that. What did they say that achieved, basically? How did that help them?
So essentially all protections in terms of endpoint protection were basically turned off when they booted the system into safe mode. They were able to forcibly, remotely put a system into safe mode, make the user's desktop look like they weren't in safe mode, and be able to go around the system undetected, and then either flip it back or just run for a while the system was in safe mode.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I haven't looked at that. We can take a look at that. Maybe it could be interesting. We'll check that out.
What was scary for me was, one, it didn't get a lot of publicity, which is why I wanted to air it on the show, because I think it was important for the security community to hear that message. The other thing was, it didn't seem like that there was a way to prevent or disable safe mode in any fashion inside of Windows systems, which was kind of scary.
Yeah, interesting.
The other thing was, it is sometimes kind of obvious going into safe mode. It does leave logs. They were able to wipe the logs. And there was an interesting scenario there too, but that was kind of a frightening one for me.
Yeah, I got their blog post up about that. I'm going to dig into this.
Yeah, check that out, because I thought that was some of the more interesting research. The other one is a Windows 10 vulnerability called atom bombing.
Yeah, yep.
Have you looked into that one?
I was just reading about that today, actually, yeah.
Yep. So if you could, you probably can explain it way better than I can in terms of what is this attack, and how does it present in the system, and what can we do to detect it?
Yeah, so it looks like, I gave this a skim and talked to some of our folks about it just today. So it appears to be a novel code injection technique. We haven't actually tried it out, but the idea is just kind of like a 3-step deal, as I understood it, where we're going to just sort of write data in the target's, the process's address space, hijack a thread, clean up, and go. So it looks like they're using asynchronous procedure calls. As they do this, they kind of use a pretty interesting ROP chain to make things happen, and go. So we haven't looked at this too much. We want to run it. It looks like they put some stuff into their GitHub repo. We got to pull that down and run it. But we were talking about how do we detect this. It's not clear. We've got some pretty cool shellcode preventions in our product right now. I'm not sure it's going to catch that. But the kind of cool thing is some other stuff we're doing to look for evidence of injected memory and running processes. We're pretty sure we would kind of find that, because, again, it's just sort of a method of getting the code to go. And once it does, it's going to have some strange anomalies in memory that are going to stick out, like things like potentially a weird thread start address or things along that line. So there's other ways to kind of – it's like there's kind of a 2-step detection process. It's one, to find it as it's happening. So as this particular atom thing goes, which is to get around things like, as my understanding, like this calls to virtual alloc EX that some security systems kind of rely on as something they look for, and bypass that to get things kind of written in and executed. So you may be able to bypass that actual injection detection, and then how can you then go ahead and inject detected code at scale, which becomes like another problem we thought about, because there's always going to be new ways to inject code into processes. So you want to make sure we have, as we're thinking about ways to stop and find bad, have some capability to detect different types of injection techniques, of which, there's always going to be more. Here's one here. So it's like, let's think that, hey, they're going to bypass some of those preventions to do injection. What does it then look like once injected code is running on a system?
No, I like the way you've separated the injection of the code from the execution of the code. So there's almost like two phases in which you can detect when bad things are happening on the system. They talked about an atom table being used to share information between processes. I was still trying to kind of unravel that and figure out what it did. But I thought it was a pretty novel new attack.
Yeah, we hadn't seen this before, so I think this is new, and I'm actually super curious to test our stuff against it. I think it might. We'll see if it bypasses some of our injection prevention, but I'm pretty certain our some of our detections for the stuff running are going to work great.
Yeah, you must be bombarded with these kinds of attacks all the time, and it amazes me every week when I learn about these new attacks again. Like just when I thought we could get pretty good coverage about how to execute and inject things on Windows systems, someone's always coming up with something new.
Yeah, and you see that. We've tracked persistence locations on Windows boxes pretty closely, and you got guys like Hexacorn posting novel ways to go persist code on Windows constantly. So it is like this. You're never done with as a vendor building a product to do detection. You're never done because all the time new stuff pops out. You got to go research it and think about, hey, do we catch this? Do we not catch this? And then if we don't catch it, how in the world are we going to go catch this thing? So you got to stay on your toes, and you're never done with a feature.
What's the we have another article actually in the stories that I thought was really good, and we talked about Dark Reading Room before in our previous show, and then I read this article from Dark Reading Room and I'm like, wow, that was a really good article. I take back what I said about Dark Reading Room, but they talked about the 20 different criteria and questions that you would ask before adopting endpoint technologies. Yep. And one of the more obvious ones is, what's the performance impact, and how does it not interfere with what the system is supposed to do? So we talked about these great detection techniques, but how do you stay somewhat in the background and make sure that it doesn't impact the system?
Yeah, with a huge amount of testing. So you have to kind of know what, how lightweight is your feature in the first place. And we do all kinds of testing. It's probably the most boring, but one of the most important sets of things we do, both to make sure the thing doesn't go false positive like crazy. Want to make sure it actually detects what we think it detects. And then, like you mentioned, performance is a big deal. And we want to keep things, kind of in a 10% memory and CPU overhead, or rather 10% sort of CPU utilization, low memory footprint, and not much. Can't take up their whole disk with cache data that you're just hiding from them. So that's a big deal. It's doable, but it takes a lot of work and a really concerted engineering effort. And you can't just slap this stuff together and hope it's going to work. And especially when you got a lot of different things running at the same time, there's a lot of different kind of test scenarios to deal with. And you find bugs, you fix them, and you move on. But it's doable. It's definitely doable.
Mark, what's one of the things that really amazed you about something that you implemented that is highly successful in detecting the bad on systems? Yeah,
there's a few things. Cody was in a couple weeks ago. I don't know how many of the listeners heard that, but you should listen to that because his exploit prevention stuff he's done is amazing. But outside of that, we've got, how do you run on disk? You got stuff in memory only, or you have stuff that hits disk. And so there's a couple of really cool things that I've seen, one of which, and I'm not a data scientist, but some of the stuff that can be done with machine learning and security. And I think that's oftentimes becoming a buzzword now, and people just think
I was just going to say that. Covering enterprise security solutions, Mark, it just seems like a buzzword. Everyone's using machine learning, artificial intelligence all over the place. But
totally understand that. And I think especially when it comes to some of that UBA stuff, it gets really hand wavy really fast. But I'll tell you, I came in and I didn't actually believe some of the stuff that could be done with analyzing data. We've got machine learning applied to malware classification. So hey, is this PE file good or bad with no prior knowledge of it? So it's kind of foundational to our let's detect bad stuff without knowledge of signatures. So using with a pretty small footprint on our endpoint, we're running a model that's 2.5 megs in size, where you're able to detect if you smartly set this thing up. Like 99.5% of malware that hits a box, and that's not a made up number. It's actually backed up by our testing. So the fact that you can just take a file, extract features from it all statically, no connection to a cloud required, run it through a machine learning classifier, get an output. It's really spectacular. So
you don't go back. So you don't take data from the system and then compare it to the cloud. You're doing this on the endpoint in implementing the machine learning.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of products out there that are kind of neutered unless they have a cloud connection, and I don't think a lot of companies want to have just kind of arbitrary data leaving their networks.
Yep.
So we try to build things with an idea in mind that we want things your data is your data. We're going to push as much capability into your network as possible. And actually, all the things I talked about are doable. They require no external connection whatsoever, except for if we update models and things like that with every week, every couple weeks. But it's all on actually our endpoint alone. So this stuff gets trained in our cloud. We push it down this tiny lightweight package, and it actually produces results that are incredibly useful for finding malware. It's pretty cool stuff, and the technology.
I didn't know that. That is really cool. I mean, that's.
Yeah, we pretty much look at a piece of malware. We extract about 17 different features from that. I forget what the number is right now, but it's quite a bit. Just anything you can think of, like byte level entropy, sliding histograms, and then stuff from like if you run PE info on a file, all those things can come up. Plus some more like some little super like secret sauce things we do to make the thing better. But it basically turns a PE file into an array of like 3,000 floating point numbers. We jam that into some modeling software that was created with physics applications in mind, and we're able to determine whether malware is good or bad. It's really cool stuff. So that, me not being a data scientist and being more of a threat intel malware guy, that was pretty amazing to see that, because I thought that was all hand wavy and not a real thing, but there's some power behind that.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty slick. And then in terms of we talked about stuff running only in memory, your pen tester friends having a lot of success with PowerShell. That's totally legit, and it's allowing pen testing teams to run, really just, hey, do whatever you want in memory. It's super powerful, and it's really, there's not a lot out there that's finding that stuff on systems. And so we've looked at how do we deal with that and think about, okay, let's just look at running processes. Let's find indicators of injected code, whether that's process hollowing, side loading, module overriding. There's all kinds of stuff you can do to stealthily run in memory. And the deal ends up being like injected code. It runs in memory, usually not backed by a file on disk. So we look at running threads in memory to find weirdness happening at runtime in seconds. And it was another one of those things like, hey, is this going to work? Is this going to throw off tons of false positives? But we're finding it's kind of lights up like pen testing activity like a Christmas tree when we set this thing off.
It's interesting what you're describing on the endpoint side in kind of a teaser to our webcast. We're doing very similar things on the network side. In that our solutions are very complementary in our approaches to it. And to some of the other vendors that I'm really excited about use very similar methods. In fact, very similar methods are being used in web application technologies as well to do the same thing. So I think you guys are doing awesome. I'm looking forward to our webcast next Tuesday. securityweekly.com/hunt if you want to hear more of Mark and some of John as well, and to talk about actually similar methods but in two different use cases to basically detect bad on your network and systems. So Mark, thank you very much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the webcast in a little bit.
Me too. Thanks, Mark.
All right, see you later.
Take care.